I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE, a global center of excellence for geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Learn how you can put geopolitics to work for your organization at ranenetwork.com.
Hello and welcome to this episode of RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast. Today, Nate Fischler, one of our Asia-Pacific analysts, is joining the podcast to discuss the lead-up and outcome of Australia's recent federal election, and will share his insights into the implications of this election for Australia's economic and political environment going forward. Hi, Nate. How's it going?
Doing well, Emma. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Do you want to start out by explaining what the expected outcome of this election was and how it compared to / differed from the actual election results?
Sure. For the past, Labor won, the incumbent Labor Party won in basically a landslide. They were able to secure 93 seats in the 150-member House of Representatives. So they did, they exceeded pretty much everybody's expectations. Sort of a shock result, leading up to it. The polling did not indicate a landslide as such, but, it is interesting because going into 2025, Labor was slightly behind its opponent, the Liberal National Coalition, or the LNC, we can call for short, which had consistently building a small lead in the polls ahead of Labor over the past year or so. And then after Donald Trump was elected in the United States, and especially after his tariff policy started being announced, that started slipping, and then Labor sort of climbed back up into the polls. And then by the last week or two before the election, it was projected that Labor would have basically secure enough for a minority government, so a win over the LNC, but not this sort of landslide that it ended up having. So basically, there was a lot of seesawing in the expectations in the months and then weeks leading up to the election, and then the final outcome was a very decisive Labor win, and conversely for the LNC, sort of a collapse scenario for them. They ended up earning only 43 seats as a result, so their influence is significantly diminished as a consequence.
Given kind of the current political situation, what does Australia's relationship with the U.S. look like in the near and far term?
Yeah, so the Australian relationship with the U.S. is still extremely important, despite what I just said about the sort of negative reaction to Donald Trump. None of the parties in Australia nor the electorate are particularly enthused, or a very small portion, I should say, are enthused about the United States president. But, structural realities mean that alliance remains very important. Of course, both the U.S. and Australia are part of the AUKUS Security Pact with the United Kingdom. It's a trilateral security bloc that those countries have developed, and that's all about sharing technology, breakthrough military technology, AI, hypersonics, that sort of thing. And the centerpiece of it, the Pillar 1 element of it, is to provide nuclear-powered submarines to the Australians. Washington, or the United States, is supposed to build those submarines and then transfer them to the Australians and give the Australians the technology to build them out themselves in the future. And this is, locked in. This is very important to particularly Australia's, national security policy. And then, they released, Labor released a budget, 2025-26 fiscal year budget, before the election, which further entrenched Australian national security with U.S., defense industrial supply chains. So both countries perceive China as a threat, as a risk, and that will continue. So there is tension in this relationship. But the structural realities mean that drivers to continue the alliance are very strong. It's not going anywhere. So it's incumbent on the two governments to sort of smooth out their differences going forward. Because there's not really much of a choice. There's not much of an alternative at this point, given the commitments that have been made in prior years.
Can you talk about how the LNC party's approach to energy differs from the Labour Party's approach to energy, and what changes we may expect to see based on the fact that this was not the party that was expected to win?
Sure. I'll just reiterate that in the last week or two, we did expect Labour to best the LNC, but not at this margin. And it was sort of a shift from prior months. But having said that, I mean, we're going to get continuity, and we're going to get an even stronger, Albanese helming as prime minister, and a stronger Labour Party who will have a freer hand to pursue the same energy policies it had been pursuing with less opposition, not only from the LNC, but also from Greens and Teal independents who did not do very well in the elections. So it was really a strong Labour victory. I'll just reemphasize that point. But the continuity and strengthening of those energy policies, I mean, that's probably among the largest policy differences between Labour and the LNC going into it. So Labour will accelerate, its green commitments that are very strong. They're, looking to phase out fossil fuels, looking to power 82% of the Australian energy grid with renewables by 2030. That's up from a current around 40% or so of their grid. And they've tightened regulations around fossil fuels and around gas, for example, as a transitionary energy source into the green energy transition. And those regulations and the tightening around those things will stay in place. So we're going to see a huge commitment to green energy that we might not otherwise have gotten with a different outcome. So, for example, the LNC was looking to deregulate fossil fuel industry, looking to lean more into gas as a transitionary source of energy. They're looking to do more exploration in order to uncover more oil and gas, those kinds of projects, while also looking into lifting the ban on nuclear power that Australia has in place. So that's a counterfactual. None of that's going to happen now. But basically, to boil it down, you have a very strong commitment now to renewable and green energy at the expense of gas and fossil fuels, and even nuclear energy, with the ban on that remaining in place for now.
And what are the major differences in foreign policy approach, specifically regarding China, between the two parties?
So there's a lot less daylight between the two on that particular issue. I mean, there are some differences that we can point to. If you recall, back during the COVID-19 pandemic, the LNC was leading the government at that time, and they called for very publicly. They called for an international investigation into the origins of COVID-19. And that really put a wedge in Chinese-Australian relations. In response, China slapped significant trade restrictions on Australian exports into China. Key exports like seafood, lobster, wine, beef, barley. A lot of these products that sectorally really impacted certain segments of the Australian economy and Australian society. And then, so there's kind of a hostility between the LNC in particular and China. And then when Albanese came in, or the Labour Party came in after that, one of their priorities was shoring up the trade relationship with China. And they succeeded in doing that. At this point, all of those restrictions, or almost all of them, virtually all of them, have been lifted by China. And that's in large part thanks to the Labour Party, Albanese's diplomatic efforts with respect to China, and that has been more or less a success. So Basically, the LNC would be more hawkish rhetorically toward China, would be less likely to reach this sort of trade accommodation that labor has, and would probably risk getting new trade restrictions slapped on it based on that. But having said all of that, I mean, a lot of that's rhetorical, a lot of that's diplomatic posturing, and that's where the difference lies. But in on the ground, in actuality, both perceive China as a threat, as the top threat to Australia. This really kind of was driven home in February when China conducted live fire naval drills in the Tasman Sea without forewarning. That's the body of water in between Australia and New Zealand. It sort of caused a panic, a small panic. I don't want to overstate that, but it definitely surprised Australia and caused a lot of concern and reminded everybody that there is security tension with China regardless of who would win the election. Both of them, both the LNC and Labour, would remain in the AUKUS agreement that I mentioned previously, seeking nuclear-powered submarines, seeking to bolster the defense industrial base, and also lowering dependence on China for critical mineral supply chains, refining, that sort of thing, in order to lower dependence and strategically decouple in particular sectors deemed sensitive to national security from China. So, on the broader level, on the base level, there's not that much difference, but their approaches are different. And Albanese, his record compared to his predecessor, Scott Morrison, is more diplomatic, more willing to compromise, and just sort of having a less hawkish disposition toward Beijing. But nonetheless, those underlying drivers are still in place. The two countries are competing for influence in the Pacific Islands geography that has traditionally been the Australian backyard, people like to say, or the Australian sphere of influence that China has sort of chipped away at over the years, particularly with the Solomon Islands Security Pact that it signed a few years back. And, both the LNC and Labour would be interested in blunting further Chinese influence into that region. So, yeah, it's going to remain a priority. The tensions are going to remain, elevated. But there are, difference of degree, difference of disposition, and that sort of thing. But ultimately not all that different.
Do you think changes made by the Labour Party will be sustainable beyond this administration, or will there be kind of a pendulum swinging back when the next election happens?
Yeah, well, as the polling, over the last year or so in Australia showed us, it's very hard to predict that sort of thing. But we can speculate a little bit. I mean, one of the reasons that, or maybe the main reason that Labour prior to Trump coming in was slipping in the polls is cost of living concerns among Australians. And then the Trump effect, if we can call it that, definitely had a profound impact on the election. We had like 68% of exit polling, moderate, self-identifying moderate voters saying the LNC went too far right, adopted too much of the MAGA language, if you can call it that. We spent too much focus on so-called anti-woke culture stuff, and that really turned off a lot of Australian voters. But it didn't address what had made Labour unpopular, which was largely the cost of living issue, and that the outrage, if I can use that word, or the sort of the distaste for the U.S. Trump administration is something that is sort of likely to fade. I mean, that was right off the back of Trump being inaugurated in the U.S. in January. But, if nothing is done to address the cost of living concerns, I mean, that issue is going to come back to the fore. If Labour doesn't account for that, then yeah, it might be in a little bit of electoral trouble. It might see its popularity decline again because, that was a very sort of one-time issue that drove its landslide win, and it had very little to do with actually addressing underlying grassroots issues like cost of living. So that's kind of what we need to watch in terms of Labor's sustained popularity, if they can sort of soothe voters' worries around that. Having said all of that, I mean, the LNC is really in a bind now. They have their power has diminished severely, so they're also going to have to rebuild organizationally. They're going to have to sort of rebrand their rhetoric a little bit. So both of these parties have work to do in order to in Labor's case, sustain their position, and in the LNC's case, take advantage of potential slippage in future Labor popularity. So, some speculative points there, but ultimately the cost of living and some of those more kitchen table issues will drive voter sentiment going forward. So we'll just have to see, I guess, is the short answer.
Well, thanks for sharing the insights, Nate. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I think that's good.
Well, readers can read more of Nate's analyses, the post-election analysis piece on our platform that you can read by signing up at ranenetwork.com, where you can also learn more about our suite of risk intelligence products and solutions at ranenetwork.com. Thanks for listening.